Welcome back to a new series. Alrighty, so we're gonna be kicking off a new series. It is part of the bigger umbrella of the VBA series. We've seen that we can use VBA across many applications that belong to Microsoft Office and even things beyond Microsoft Office, including Adobe. Well, what we're going to do next is we are now going to start exploring the world of Access VBA. That's right. So we're going to take our wonderful Microsoft Access application. This particular application is for those of you who want to create a local copy of a database on your system and basically be able to store data in a more structured format and be able to do all sorts of database tasks that you would normally do in like an enterprise database, but in a much smaller, concise fashion. So you don't get, all the fancy, little tools here and there that you might find in, say, Microsoft SQL Server, but you definitely get some nice tools. And for those who have small businesses or just have your own personal data collection that you want in a more structured format, then maybe Access makes a lot of sense for you. So the ultimate goal with this series is to get us familiar with the different objects inside of Microsoft Access. We've seen before, there's different objects like we've seen with Excel, right? So we have our application object, you have your workbook objects, you got your worksheet objects, and so on and so on. So, hopefully at this point, that hierarchy, if you've been following since the beginning, it should be pretty apparent once we start getting into it. But pretty much like all my other series, this first video is just kind of exploring the object hierarchy, kind of playing around with some maybe common functionality that we're all used to doing inside of Access. And then as time goes on, we'll show how to do more and more complex stuff. So our first, what I would call complex series, would be how do we take a data table inside of Excel and import it into into an Access database using just VBA. So pretty neat. I think a lot of people will find that helpful. And maybe at some point I am kind of considering doing some videos showing how we can take different content from Office documents, things like Word documents, things like PowerPoint presentations, and being able to grab all the content from those documents, create some structured data, sources from it. So being able to take like an Excel, create it to JSON, being able to take a Word document, creating a JSON document based off of that. That's probably going to fall under our Python series, but that's kind of the ultimate goal with some of these Office applications is really kind of showing us how to parse and get information from them. Alrighty, so with that being said, let's get started. So Access is a little bit different than other Office applications, at least in terms of accessing Visual Basic from it. You can actually access it right away from the ribbon. You don't have to go and enable any tab on your ribbon bar or anything like that. Normally, when you create a new Access database, you'll actually be prompted about where you want to store this database. So this is, again, one of the nice things about it is you can put it pretty much anywhere you want on your system. Now, the Access database that I currently have, the one I'm currently in, so the one that you see right now, is actually on my OneDrive, right? So I have it under a folder called Growth Tutorial Videos, and it's under my VBA Access tutorial series. So this database is living in an actual folder. And when you create a new database, you're more than likely going to have a screen like this. You're not going to have any tables or queries or modules or anything like that. It's going to be all blank. But to get to the Visual Basic editor, it's pretty straightforward. You would just go to your database tools. And on this particular tab, you're going to see a section for macros. So like I said, previous applications, you had to enable this tab in order to see this functionality. With this one, it's actually a lot easier. You just go to Visual Basic. And when you create a module inside of Visual Basic, you're actually able to see it from your task pane that is inside of Access. So this All Access Objects task pane, you would actually see all of your modules right from here. So this is another way to access existing modules inside of your database. So now that we are in the Visual Basic editor, let's create a new module. So we'll insert a new module. At the top, usually it has this option compare database. I don't delete it. I just leave it there. It just makes life easier. But all right, let's do this. Let's start by declaring our variables. We're going to create a new subroutine. We'll just call it work with database, something like that. We probably should give our module a name as well. So I would say intro to access VBA, give it some kind of name like that. And then from here, we're going to declare our variables. Now, I will warn you a little bit when it comes to reading the documentation on Microsoft for Access VBA. It's a little bit confusing at times because, for example, certain objects that you're going to be working with fall under what is called the Microsoft Data Access Objects reference. That's kind of its own section on Microsoft's documentation portal. So I will have links there, but don't be surprised if you find yourself jumping between two different forms of documentation. If you're working with the actual data objects, things like record sets, things like even really just database objects themselves, you'll find yourself really in that section. And then if you're working with the actual Access VBA object model, then you would go to your traditional Office VBA reference. And here you'll see all the different things and stuff like that. So that's the only kind of warning I'm going to give you is do not be surprised if you find yourself jumping in between two sources of documentation in order to write your code, because it's not all in one thing. So like pretty much every single other Office application, we will have an application object that obviously refers to the application that you're writing the code in. In this case, it's Access. Now, inside of Access, we don't have documents, we don't have workbooks, we don't have presentations, we have databases, right? So that's your kind of workbook, but now since we're in Access, it's a database because, Access is all about databases. So if you want to work with the database, you would declare a database object. Now, as you guessed, you can have multiple Access applications open at once. Each of those Access applications can refer to a different database. What that means is, like pretty much every other object out there, there's a collection. So a single database refers to a single database in Access, but a collection of multiple databases also exists. That would fall under your databases collection. That contains all the databases that are currently opened inside of Microsoft Access. So just be aware of that. But in this situation, we're not going to work with the collection yet. We're just going to work with the current database that we have open. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is something called an access table. Now, it's a little bit confusing because you'll see things called table definitions. That's very different, right? So you'll see table objects, you'll see table defs, you'll see table style elements, lots of different things that actually belong to tables. But if you want to work with the actual table itself, that is considered a table definition. So it's how you define that table. Now, when you're working in the world of a database, remember, everything's structured, okay? So it's not like Excel where you can just have these mix of data types and you can have some data over here, some data in that worksheet, some data in that worksheet. When you're working inside of a database, you got to follow certain rules, okay? So if you start trying to work in a very flexible format, you'll find that you're going to run into a lot of issues. So one thing that we do inside of databases is we'll define a table and we'll basically tell the database, hey, inside of this table, you're going to have so many columns, and those columns are going to have certain data types. Basically, you're giving it a schema, okay? You're telling the database what kind of data is going to be in there and how it's going to be structured. Well, what's the benefit of doing that, right? Well, normally you get a tremendous performance boost from it, right? If I don't have to infer all the different data types that potentially could exist in that table, but you just tell me up front, that's less work I have to do in the back end. So it's a trade-off, right? You've got to tell me more up front, but the trade-off is it's going to work a lot faster. One of those things. And then naturally, when you're working with very large data sets, guess what? It pays to do that. It's going to be easier to calculate things. It's going to be easier to match and merge data. So by following this structure, you get a ton of benefits down the road when it comes to mashing up data and even calculating it sometimes. All right, next object. So we're going to have something called a record set. Now, we've worked with record sets before if you followed my VBA tutorials, especially inside of Excel. A record set is basically like a query that we've executed on a table, right? So we'll find that there's a query definition, so that defines the actual query that goes and gets the data. But what's returned back to us when we execute that query is a record set, which contains the actual data that we asked for. So we're going to be working with a record set very briefly, nothing super fancy, but a record set is basically that data that we queried. And now it's just in this object called a record set, which makes sense because we know a table is made up of multiple records. So it makes sense why we would call it a record set. Alrighty. Then from here, let's grab the access application. So that's very straightforward. You would set the access app object variable to what we call the application object. Now, you might see multiple applications in here. Just go to the top one. That's usually the actual application. Sometimes you can do these other ones. They might not work as intended. So normally I just try to keep it to the top one. That seems to usually work fine. Now, here comes the fun part, because you will see different documentation depending on what you read. So we're going to grab the current database, right? Well, what does the current database reflect? Well, it's the database that you are currently working in. So the current database is the one that you're currently working in. So it's kind of like your active workbook or your active presentation or your active document. It reflects the one that you're currently in. Now, depending on what version of Access you're on, you might have to do this a little bit differently. If you're on Access that comes after 2007, so after 2007, then you would do Access App, and there's going to be a method called current DB that reflects the current database. If you are on Access that comes before 2007, then you're going to do it a little bit differently. You're going to be doing application, or sorry, in this case, Access App. There is a property called the database engine. This is what's doing all the calculations, all that kind of fun stuff. And that database engine has a workspaces collection. So these are the different databases you kind of have open. If you grab the first one, the one that you're currently in, you'll notice that that also has a databases collection. Again, if you just grab the first one, you should be good to go. Now, it's also a collection. So again, you could have multiple of these potentially. I find that you would not be using this one after 2007. So you do not use this after 2007. You really should just be doing your Access App current DB. So I'll put a little note here for us. Only use if you are on Access 2007 or earlier, which pretty much is going to be nobody. That's a much older application. Most people are on some type of later version of Microsoft Access. Okay, so we now have our Access database, so the database that we have. There are some properties that we might want to print out, so we'll print out the full file path. So we'll do debug, print, access database. There is, what did I misspell? There's always something. Oh, databases, that's why. Okay, so with this one, there would be a name property. This will print the full file path. So it's again a little bit misleading. It's not the actual name, it's the full file path. Now, additionally, there's other collections that exist inside of your Access database, right? So you have a containers collection. You have a queries definitions collection. You have a properties collection, a record sets collection, table definitions collection, transactions collection. So like most other Applications are kind of high-level objects. They contain a lot more different collections. So if we want to get to lower level objects, we're more than likely going to have to navigate through that collection. So let's just say for a second we wanted to print out the number of table definitions number of table definitions in our collection. Well, like any other collection, we know there's a count property. So this will return the number of table definitions inside of our Access database. So let's print it out and see what we get. So you can see right here that we currently have our full name, which is really just our file path. And then we have 14 table definitions. That's kind of odd. I clearly see only 2 here. So how do we have 14? You have to keep in mind there's a bunch of system table definitions in there. So they monitor different things like log records or allow you to get other information about your database. So things like table structures, things like, just different information about your database. They might already be predefined in those definitions. You don't see them from your particular navigation pane, but they do exist. So they are part of your table definitions collection. That's why you also have to be a little bit careful when you're working with your tables definitions collection, because if you're not working with the right table, you potentially could be modifying something you don't really intend to modify. So just again, keep that in mind as you're going through this. Okay, and then so this one is print out the number of table definitions in our database. All right. Next one. Okay, so we're going to create a new table definition. When you create a new table definition, it's like you are going right here to your little tables thing, and you would go to your Create tab, and you would create a new table. So when you create a new table definition, it's like you're creating a new table. So we're going to do it much more explicitly though, because you can see right here, this one just has 1 column and stuff like that. We haven't given it a name. We haven't given it any columns or anything like that. It's just kind of the standard table anytime you create it. So we're going to create a new table, but we're going to make ours a little bit more sophisticated. We are going to add different things like columns. We're going to give those columns some data types, and then we'll try to add some records to our table. We're not going to do anything super complicated at this point, but just very basic stuff. So if we want to create a new table definition, it's pretty straightforward. We would first create a reference to it, because at some point we're going to want to add to it. So we'll say set access table equal, we're going to call our access database. It has a create table def. So this is going to create a new table definition object. And then there's some properties that we can give it. One is pretty much the obvious one, which is the name of the table. We'll call this one stock prices video. There's some other stuff in here too, things like attributes, source table name. So if this table is going to be created from an already existing table, then you can define where that existing table is, or that name where the data is. And then there's connect and stuff like that. For the most part, most people are going to just have a blank table, and then they would add records to it. Down the road, we'll show more complex operations when we get to the actual table definition object. But for right now, let's just keep it simple. We'll create a new table and we'll just give it a name. So we'll create a new table in our Access database and call it stock prices video. Perfect. Period. So we have a table definition. I'm going to run this. And then you go, okay, great. So we created it. So shouldn't we see it right here? We don't see it. What's going on? Normally in Excel, for example, if we create a new worksheet, it just kind of automatically appears. Did we do something wrong? Doesn't look like it. Seems like it's running each time. So this is another kind of caveat when you're working with Access. Just because you've created an object doesn't mean you can see it. There's usually another method that you have to call after. Now, just because you've created that object doesn't mean it's part of the table's definitions collection. So a little bit different, but anytime you create a new table definition, you have to append it. You have to append it or add it to the table definitions collection. So we're going to now add the new table we just created to the table definitions collection. So all we do is we call our access database object. We know there's a tables definitions collection, but there's this append method. When you append it, you're going to append the object that you want to be part of that collection. In this case, it's that table definition we made up above. Now, once you've added it in there, you can't add it again. So if I run that code, it's going to add it. But then if I try to run the code again, I'm not going to be able to run it because it's going to say it already exists. So before you run this, if you want to be able to see it inside of your task pane, there's one more line you have to write. Basically, it just refreshes the pane so that way you can see it. So if you want to see it, you would then refresh the access database pane. So you go to access database, there is a table defs, and guess what? There's a refresh method. If I run this, I should be able to see it right here. So let's run it. Did I misspell something? What did it say? Oh, wait, I think you... Oh, that's why. So I skipped ahead a little bit. I should have looked at my notes. My bad. So you can't have an empty table. What do I mean by that? Well, you can have an empty table, but you can't have a table where you haven't defined any fields. What do I mean by fields? I mean columns, basically. So you can have a table. The problem is you can't append a table to the table definitions collection if you haven't defined any fields in that table. So what I'm going to do is right after this line, I'm going to take the new table and add some fields to it. Fields are like the columns. So we're going to say with access table and with, well, what do we want to do? Well, first things first is we can add some fields to it. So add a field for the date, not data, date. So there is a field collection, and kind of like the table definitions collection, there's an append method, and then you would do the create field method. And then just like with this one, there's some information you need to provide. The first one is the name. In this case, we'll call this date. And then you need to give it a data type, right? So this is the data type that will be stored in that column. In this situation, I'm going to do a DB date. Now you can see there's many different data types in here. So first you need to figure out what kind of data type you want. And then once you've defined that, you just need to make sure that you specify it correctly. So that's just adding one field to our database. So let's run our code again and see what we get. So it looks like it ran successfully that time. And just like the other one, sometimes this is the bug. I didn't want to have to talk about the bug, but now I'm going to have to talk about the bug. Oh, love it. So there's a problem sometimes, which is you won't necessarily see it. You can run it, but for whatever reason, it won't actually show the first time. And you can see here, it's already saying that it existed. And so now we're running into this problem where we can't see it from the pane, but it's clearly in the table definition. So what I'll do next is I'm gonna play around with it a little bit. There's a couple different things you can do. I'm still kind of looking through what might be the best approach to this. I unfortunately don't have a super great answer for you. I wish I did. But one thing I've done is I'll take the application and it does have these different refresh methods that I've played around with. Sometimes they seem to work. That time it seemed fine. So there's kind of different options. One is you call this one first. If that one doesn't work, then you would call this one second. If that one still doesn't work, the only other option you would have is you have to close down the entire database and then you reopen it. That seems to fix the issue. I have read on Stack Overflow that in some cases, albeit extremely rare, that actually won't fix it either. So it's kind of just one of those things you have to be aware of as you're adding stuff. Is just because you've created it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to see it. There's techniques that you can use to get it to pop up here, but some cases it's not going to always do that. And you might have to just delete the table. And in that situation, try to run the code again and see what happens. So just again, be aware of that. I love delivering bad news like that, but you can tell it kind of sucks sometimes. And you can see here, it still has our field definition. So that's great. It means it did exactly what we wanted. So I'm going to add a couple more fields, but the first thing I want to do is I obviously want to make sure I delete it first, because if I try to add it and it's already there, you got a problem, right? So we'll just create a couple more fields, nothing super crazy, just basic information that we might want to put in there. This is mimicking like, you had stocks or something like that. So, nothing super crazy stuff we should be pretty familiar with at this point. So we'll have close. And again, we'll see definitely a more complex example when we start importing data directly from Excel. There's a lot we have to check for and stuff like that. So again, don't worry, you'll be confused at some point, I'm sure. I know I was. Oh, I didn't tell you too. So the channel officially has a mascot. It's a snake. It's pretty cool. I got a snake over Christmas. I've been deathly afraid of snakes most of my life, but I thought this is a good chance. I can confront the fear, and well, I want to call it a fear. It was more of I had an obsession with it, and then I said, well, you know what? I just need to get it, and I've gotten it. He's been very calm. Well, actually, I don't know the gender, so I shouldn't call it he. Apparently, like they never decided, they never gendered it. So now I'm like, is it a girl? Is it a boy? If it's a girl, it's going to get like potentially 5 feet. If it's a guy, it only gets like, I think they said like 3 to 4 feet. So it's a ball python. It's pretty cool though. It's very peaceful. But I have to leave it alone for like a week or two, and then I have to try to do a first feeding. Okay, so as you can see that I have just created 5 different fields, so basically 5 different columns. One of those is a date, and then 4 of those are double, so basically like, decimals and stuff like that. I would do the same exact stuff I'm doing right here. I'm just gonna refresh the access database tables definitions, and then if that doesn't work, try this. Don't you love when there's bugs or non-intuitive methods? Let's try it again. Okay, that worked fine that time. And now you can see that there are 5 different columns. So again, it seems to be working great. Obviously, there's no data inside of our table, so we're going to add some data in here as well. So this is when we're going to start going into a record set. And so once you've done this little section up here, you can actually do the following down here. So once we add, let me scroll down a little bit, add the table to the database. Let's add some data. Ooh. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set our access record object equal to our access database. That has a method called open record set. So this will open a new record set. There doesn't technically have to be anything inside of it. It can be empty. In this situation, the new name records or the new record set we're going to be opening is for our stock prices table. But again, we want to make sure it's what we're seeing up here. So stock prices video. You can call, clearly you can call your table whatever you want. You don't have to call it stock prices. You could call it, Alex, you could call it Sigma coding. It doesn't really matter. It's just, you just want to make sure you're consistent with it. Okay, and then from here, we're going to use the add new method to add a new record to our record set. And so what we'll do is we're going to go down here, and then we're going to add a new record to our record set. It's a little bit confusing because, you would imagine that if you're going to do it here, you would specify all your values on this line. You don't. You just call add new. And then from here, after you've called that method, you would then specify the values basically for each of the individual fields. So specify the values for each of the fields in the table. Now, technically, you don't have to fill out every single field. You could maybe do one column or two of the columns, but typically speaking, when you're inserting data, you're inserting a value for each field. But again, you don't obviously have to do that. It's just kind of commonality. You would do that. So you would have your access record. In this situation, if you want to specify the column, it would just be the name of the column. And then it has a value property. And then you would just pass through the value that you would put in there. In this one, I can do an ISO formatted date and it should work fine. And you're basically just going to repeat this multiple times for each column in that particular database or that particular table. So we have open, we have a close, you would have a high, and then you would have your low. Obviously, they're not going to all be dates, but you can kind of hopefully see the pattern that's forming right here. So we'll have this one be 12. We'll have this one be 12.2. We'll have this one be 12.3. And then we'll have this one be 11.99. Just because you've created your record doesn't mean you're going to be able to see it. So now we need to update the record set. So all you do is you call your access record, and then you would have a, an update method. Hold on one second. That's what I was afraid of. I misspelled it again. Damn. Keep doing that. Actually, you know what? I'll just rename it up there so I don't have to do it multiple times. But you can kind of see, and then from here, you can kind of see the different stuff that's happening. So now if I run it again, I should be able to now see a single row inside of my database, which looks good. So it looks like it successfully added a single row to our table. People are now naturally going to ask, well, how do I do multiple records, right? How do I do that? We'll show you how to do that in the Excel one. Trust me, it's not too bad. There's a lot of for loops, and you just have to definitely make sure you're checking things before you're starting to add, because it's really easy to have errors arise when you're running your code. So we just got to be aware of that. Alrighty, so that does it for this video. This was kind of our introduction to Access VBA. In our next video, we're going to be working with something called query definitions. So those are actual queries that you would run usually against some tables in your Access database. So we're going to see how to create those, and then we're going to show you how to execute a particular query definition, and then being able to loop through things like the record set or something like that. Again, nothing super complicated at this point, just enough to get us familiar with it. So that way, when we move on to the more complex examples, we're not kind of sitting there and like, wait a minute, how do we use this object? We've never seen it before. So at this point, if you have any questions, please put them down in the comments below. Also, if you are new to the channel, please do consider subscribing. We always love having new subscribers. If you have some suggestions for new content in the future, I'm always open to hearing it. I do have a list growing, so you might have to wait a little bit before we get a video on it, but I'm always open to hearing new content and stuff like that. So I would say, keep an eye out for the next video, and hopefully we'll see you there. See you later, everybody.